Here's a pattern almost everyone recognizes the moment they hear it. You have a project you've been meaning to start for months. Every time you think about starting it, something stops you. Maybe the idea isn't fully formed yet. Maybe the conditions aren't quite right. Maybe you don't feel ready enough, prepared enough, motivated enough. And so you wait. You wait for the right moment, the right mood, the right level of inspiration, the right set of circumstances that will finally make you feel like now is the appropriate time to begin. And as you wait, the weeks turn into months, and the months quietly stack into years. And the thing you most wanted to do with your life sits on a shelf, perfectly preserved in its imagined potential, untouched, unblemished, and entirely unstarted. That pattern has a name, and the name isn't laziness, fear, or lack of discipline. The name is perfectionism, and it is almost certainly costing you more than you know. The man who wrote the book we're covering today knows this pattern from the inside out, because he lived it for years himself. Stephen Guise is an American writer and blogger who became widely known for his earlier book Mini Habits, in which he argued that the smallest possible version of a habit, like doing just one push-up a day, was actually a more effective entry point into lasting behavioral change than ambitious, motivation-dependent plans. But it was his second major book, published in 2015, and titled How to Be an Imperfectionist, that took the same core insight and applied it directly to what he came to see as one of the most pervasive and destructive belief systems in modern life. The idea that good enough isn't good enough, that anything short of excellent is barely worth doing, and that the risk of doing something imperfectly is somehow worse than the certainty of not doing it at all. In this video, I'm going to walk you through everything genuinely useful in this book. Not just the philosophy, but the actual mechanics of how perfectionism works, why it's so hard to recognize in yourself, what specific tools the book offers for dismantling it, and how to start applying all of it today. Whether you're a chronic procrastinator, an overachiever who never feels quite satisfied with anything, or someone somewhere in between who just knows that something about their relationship with their own standards is quietly costing them more than it's giving back. Stick with me to the end, because the final section includes the single most practical shift this book offers, the one you can try within the next hour. Let's start with a question that matters more than it might seem. What exactly is perfectionism, and why is it so hard for most people to recognize when they have it? The cultural image of a perfectionist is someone extremely detail-oriented, endlessly revising and polishing their work, never satisfied with the result. And while that image does describe one version of perfectionism, the book argues it misses a large portion of the people who are actually being harmed by perfectionist thinking. Because perfectionism doesn't always look like obsessive refinement. Just as often, it looks like not starting. It looks like procrastination. It looks like abandoning things the moment they stop going perfectly. It looks like a pattern of only pursuing the things you're already good at and quietly avoiding the ones where you might look incompetent or have to go through a visible learning curve. It looks like the person who plans elaborate projects with extreme detail and then inexplicably fails to execute any of them. And it looks like the person who constantly feels like their efforts, regardless of what they actually produced, were somehow not quite enough. The thread connecting all of these very different-looking behaviors is the same underlying mechanism, a belief that results only matter if they meet a certain standard of quality or completeness, and that effort below that standard is essentially worthless. This belief, the book argues, is not just wrong. It's actively backwards, because in the real world, the relationship between effort and outcome doesn't work the way perfectionism assumes it does. In the real world, something done imperfectly is almost always worth more than something imagined perfectly, but never executed. A business plan written in a weekend and pitched imperfectly is worth more than the flawless business plan you're still refining in your head 3 years later. A conversation that goes awkwardly but happens is worth more than the perfectly rehearsed conversation that you never actually have. A workout that's shorter and less intense than planned is worth more than the ideal workout you skipped because conditions weren't quite right. The perfectionist's internal math is fundamentally broken. It treats good but imperfect as barely better than nothing, when in reality the gap between something imperfect and nothing at all is almost always enormous. Let's talk about where perfectionism actually comes from, because understanding its roots changes how you relate to it. The book argues that perfectionism doesn't arise from nowhere, and it isn't, as people sometimes assume, simply an excess of ambition or conscientiousness. It arises from a specific and very understandable psychological need: the need to protect the self from the experience of failure, inadequacy, or rejection. Here's the internal logic. If I attempt something and fail, that failure says something about my ability, my worth, or my competence. That's uncomfortable and painful. But if I never attempted at all, or if I only attempted under conditions so controlled and so ideal that failure is nearly impossible, I never have to face that evidence. The imagined version of me who could have succeeded remains perfectly intact, unthreatened by actual performance. Perfectionism is, at its heart, a defense mechanism. It looks like high standards from the outside, but it functions internally as a form of self-protection. This explains something that confuses a lot of people about perfectionism: why so many perfectionists are also procrastinators. These two things look like opposites. One seems to care too much about quality, the other seems not to care enough. But they're actually the same psychological response operating in different directions. The perfectionist delays not because they don't care, but precisely because they care too much, specifically too much about what a less than perfect outcome would say about them. As long as the project is unstarted, its potential is theoretically unlimited. The moment it's attempted, that protective illusion becomes vulnerable. The book also identifies something particularly insidious about perfectionism. It has excellent PR. In our culture, calling yourself a perfectionist is not an admission of weakness. It's often presented as a virtue, a sign of high standards and professional seriousness. Job interviews are full of people who claim their biggest weakness is caring too much about quality. This positive cultural framing makes perfectionism very difficult to honestly identify and challenge in yourself, because acknowledging it as a problem feels like admitting that you have low standards or don't care about excellence, which is precisely the accusation perfectionism was designed to protect against in the first place. The book proposes a central concept it calls imperfectionism, which is explicitly not the same as being sloppy, careless, or indifferent to quality. An imperfectionist, as Guise defines the term, is someone who has genuinely lower standards than a perfectionist in one very specific and important sense. They've lowered the threshold required to take action. They don't require motivation, inspiration, ideal conditions, or a perfect plan before beginning. They require essentially nothing except a small, manageable starting point, and they trust that quality can be refined after the fact rather than needing to be guaranteed in advance. This is a crucial distinction. The imperfectionist doesn't aim for mediocrity. They aim for progress, and they've learned through experience that progress and perfection are often genuinely incompatible, that insisting on perfection before beginning is one of the most reliable ways to produce nothing at all. The imperfectionist has essentially made a deliberate trade. They've given up the comfortable illusion of potential in exchange for the real, imperfect, sometimes awkward, sometimes genuinely surprising experience of actually doing the thing. Now let's get into the specific types of perfectionism the book identifies, because not all perfectionism looks the same, and recognizing which specific version shows up in your own life is the first step toward actually addressing it. The first type is what the book calls quality perfectionism, which most closely matches the cultural image of the perfectionist we discussed earlier. This is the person who needs everything they produce to be excellent before they'll share, submit, or release it. They revise endlessly, struggle to declare anything finished, and often delay completion indefinitely because there's always one more improvement that could be made. This type of perfectionism can sometimes produce genuinely high-quality work, but it also frequently produces paralysis, burnout, and chronic dissatisfaction, because the standard being chased always retreats just ahead of the work's actual quality, meaning nothing ever quite feels good enough. The second type is quantity perfectionism, which is less well known but arguably more common. This is the all-or-nothing thinking we touched on earlier. The person who decides to run 5 miles a day and on the day they can only run 2, just stays home instead, because if they can't do it properly, there's no point doing it at all. This type of perfectionism masquerades as commitment, but actually produces dramatically less total output than a consistently moderate approach would, because it generates the constant temptation to simply not bother when the full version isn't available. The third type is timing perfectionism, the need to wait for the right moment before beginning. Not the right mood, not the right level of readiness, not the right amount of preparation, but the right moment, which is always just slightly ahead of the present one. The new year, the first Monday of the month after the current project is finished, when things settle down a bit, when I have a clearer plan, when I've done more research. Timing perfectionism is particularly difficult to recognize because it always has a rational-sounding explanation for why right now isn't quite the best moment to begin. The fourth type is effort perfectionism, which operates not on the output but on the process itself. The effort perfectionist doesn't just need the result to be excellent. They need the process of getting there to feel right too. They need to be in the mood. They need to feel motivated. They need to feel inspired or energized. And when the motivation isn't present, which for most people is most of the time, they conclude that now isn't the right time to work on it, which in practice means the work only happens during relatively rare states of peak enthusiasm, while the vast majority of ordinary, available, perfectly workable time gets passed over because it doesn't feel appropriately charged with inspiration. The fifth type is self-image perfectionism, which is in many ways the deepest and most difficult to address. This is perfectionism applied not to specific tasks or outputs, but to the self, the belief that you should be a certain kind of person, without visible flaws, without obvious gaps in your ability, without the clumsy, uncertain, openly learning version of yourself being visible to other people. Self-image perfectionism is what produces the exhausting performance of always having it together, always knowing the answer, never visibly struggling, never admitting uncertainty or difficulty. It's also what makes asking for help feel threatening, admitting mistakes feel catastrophic, and the ordinary human experience of not knowing things or not being good at things feel like something to hide rather than something entirely normal. Now let's get into the core solution the book proposes, and the first and most fundamental piece of it is something that connects directly to Stephen Guise's earlier work on many habits. The solution isn't willpower. It isn't discipline. It isn't finding better motivation or working harder to overcome the perfectionist impulse. The solution is lowering the bar of what counts as a sufficient starting point, until the starting point is so small that the perfectionist's internal resistance has almost nothing left to push against. The specific tool the book builds everything around is the concept of a minimum standard, an explicit, deliberately tiny threshold of action that you commit to as your daily floor, not your ceiling. Not "I will write for 2 hours," but "I will open the document and write one sentence." Not "I will do a complete workout," but "I will put on my workout clothes and do one push-up." Not "I will clean the entire apartment," but "I will pick up one item that's out of place." These minimum standards are not meant to be your actual goal. They're meant to be the lowest possible version of engagement with that goal that still counts as showing up. The reason they work is the same reason we discussed in the Atomic Habits video. The hardest part of almost any action is the transition from not doing to doing, from inertia to motion. And once you're actually in motion, continuing is almost always far easier than the static version of you sitting still would have predicted. The person who gets to their desk and writes one sentence almost always writes more than one sentence. The person who puts on their workout clothes and does one push-up almost always does more than one push-up. But crucially, even if they don't, the minimum standard was still met, the day's commitment was kept, and the habit of showing up was reinforced, which is worth considerably more than the quality or quantity of output on any individual day. This directly addresses the perfectionist's core problem. They wait to begin until they feel ready to do it well. The minimum standard approach makes it essentially impossible to not be ready, because you've defined the starting point as something you're always capable of regardless of mood, energy, or inspiration. You've removed the perfectionist's primary excuse for delay by making the threshold for beginning so low that the only conceivable reason not to meet it is a genuine emergency. The book also introduces a complementary tool it calls the flexible standard, which is distinct from the minimum standard. The flexible standard applies during the activity itself, not at the entry point. Once you've met your minimum standard and you're actually doing the thing, a flexible standard means being willing to adjust your expectations in real time based on what's actually available to you that particular day, rather than insisting the session match an ideal that might not be achievable given your current energy, time, or circumstances. A rigid standard says, "If I can't do this properly, there's no point doing it at all." A flexible standard says, "I'll do the best version of this that's genuinely available to me today, whatever that turns out to be, and I'll accept that as a genuine win rather than a disappointment." This reframe is more significant than it sounds, because it removes the constantly moving goalpost that perfectionism installs. Under a flexible standard, a shortened workout is a win. A rough first draft is a win. An imperfect conversation is a win. An okay meal instead of an exceptional one is a win. The accumulation of these small, flexible, genuinely done things compounds into real progress in a way that the perpetually revised but never finished perfect version never does. Let's talk about one of the most valuable concepts in the entire book, which is the distinction between action and results. Perfectionism is fundamentally results-focused. It evaluates effort by outcome. If the outcome wasn't excellent, the effort wasn't valuable enough. The imperfectionist approach is fundamentally action-focused. It evaluates effort by whether the action happened, not by the quality of what it produced, because it recognizes something the perfectionist resists. You can control your actions, but you cannot fully control your results, especially in the early stages of anything you're learning or building. A beginning writer cannot control whether their first draft is excellent. They can only control whether they sit down and write it. A beginning investor cannot control whether their first investment performs well. They can only control whether they research and make one. A person trying to become healthier cannot control whether their first run is impressive. They can only control whether their running shoes leave the house. Perfectionism's insistence on judging worth by outcome rather than action is exactly backwards in situations where you're building a new skill or changing a habit, because it evaluates you against a standard you literally cannot meet until much later in the process. And it uses your inevitable early imperfection as evidence that you shouldn't have tried in the first place. The imperfectionist reorients around actions. I showed up. I did the thing. I wrote the sentence, ran the mile, made the call, had the conversation. That's what was within my control, and I did it. What comes of it is a separate question that will be answered by continued action over time, not by the quality of any single effort. This action over results orientation has a genuinely important psychological side effect. It dramatically reduces the emotional stakes of any individual attempt. If success means producing an excellent result, then every attempt that falls short of excellent is a small failure, and accumulating small failures is demoralizing. But if success means showing up and doing the action, then the vast majority of your attempts can be successes, because showing up is almost always achievable, even on the days when excellent output isn't. This shift alone can transform the emotional experience of pursuing any long-term goal from a chronic state of inadequacy into a genuine, sustainable sense of regular accomplishment. Let's talk about approval, because this is an area the book treats in real depth, and one that most people underestimate as a driver of their perfectionism. A significant portion of perfectionist behavior is ultimately driven not by personal standards, but by the imagined judgment of others. Other people's standards, other people's expectations, other people's assessment of what your work, your appearance, your choices, and your life are worth. The perfectionist isn't just trying to meet their own standards. They're trying to preemptively meet everyone's standards simultaneously, which is both impossible and exhausting, and which produces a particular kind of self-consciousness that makes ordinary human imperfection, the kind everyone around you already has and largely ignores, feel like something catastrophic that needs to be hidden or corrected before you can safely show up. The book's position on approval is clear. External approval is something you can want and can genuinely enjoy when it comes, but making your willingness to act contingent on the certainty of receiving it is a trap that will stop you from doing almost anything that matters, because the certainty of external approval is essentially never available in advance. You can only find out whether people will approve of something after you've done it, which means the approval seeker's strategy of, "I'll do it once I'm sure it'll be well received," is functionally identical to never doing it at all. The practical move the book recommends is not becoming indifferent to other people's opinions, which is both unrealistic and undesirable, but separating your willingness to take action from any requirement of advance approval. You act, and then you find out what people think, and you use that feedback to improve, but you don't make the act itself contingent on a guarantee you can't have. There's a related concept the book spends time on: the unreliability of motivation as a basis for action. Most people wait to feel motivated before doing things that require effort, and motivation does feel genuinely great when it shows up. The problem is that motivation is an outcome of action far more reliably than it is a precondition for action, and waiting for it before beginning creates a dependency on a psychological state that is by nature intermittent, unreliable, and completely impossible to reliably predict or control. The book's position is straightforward. Stop treating motivation as the thing that earns you the right to begin. Start treating action as the thing that tends to generate motivation as a downstream effect. You almost never feel motivated to start, but you very often feel motivated to continue once you've already started, because the act of beginning, the physical fact of being in motion towards something, produces its own momentum and its own sense of engagement that the static, anticipatory version never could. If you only ever act when you feel motivated, you will act rarely. If you act consistently regardless of whether you feel motivated, you will produce consistently, and motivation will be something you experience along the way rather than something you wait for at the entrance. Let's get into the neuroscience and psychology behind why the book's approach works, because understanding the mechanism makes it easier to trust the counterintuitive seeming advice to lower your standards rather than raise your effort. The brain has two broad systems that influence behavior in ways relevant here. The first is a threat detection and avoidance system, sometimes informally described as the brain's negativity bias, which we touched on in earlier videos. This system is constantly scanning the environment for evidence of potential failure, embarrassment, rejection, or loss. And when it finds such evidence, or even the possibility of such evidence, it generates avoidance behavior, essentially a motivational push away from the perceived threat. For a perfectionist, the threat isn't usually physical danger. It's the possibility of a result that doesn't meet their internal standard, which their brain has learned to treat with something approaching the urgency of a genuine threat. The second system is the reward and approach system, which generates the motivation to pursue things associated with pleasure, connection, achievement, or reward. This system drives engagement, creativity, and the sense of momentum that makes sustained effort feel good rather than exhausting. The problem perfectionism creates is that it keeps the threat detection system perpetually active, which tends to suppress the approach system, because the brain's threat response is calibrated to override other motivational states in order to protect the organism from perceived danger. When perfectionism convinces your brain that imperfect performance is a genuine threat, your approach system gets overridden, and what you experience as a result is the subjective feeling of avoidance, resistance, and procrastination that makes starting feel so unreasonably difficult even when you desperately want to begin. The minimum standard approach works by reducing the threat signal almost to zero. A minimum standard so small it's essentially impossible to fail at removes the perfectionist's primary source of threat, because there's no realistic way to produce a result worse than the minimum required. This allows the threat detection system to stand down, which gives the approach system room to engage, which is why people so commonly report that once they begin with a genuinely tiny action, momentum builds almost automatically. The brain's approach system has finally been given a chance to run without the constant interference of the threat system telling it to stop. There's also relevant research from self-determination theory, a framework in motivational psychology that identifies three core psychological needs: competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Perfectionism tends to undermine all three. It undermines competence by ensuring that your actual performance is almost always judged against a standard you haven't met yet, creating a chronic sense of inadequacy. It undermines autonomy by making your actions contingent on external approval or on the achievement of an externally defined standard rather than on your own genuine values and engagement. And it undermines relatedness by encouraging the performance of having it together rather than the genuine, vulnerable, imperfect connection that actually builds deep relationships. Imperfectionist practice, by shifting to action-based evaluation, removing the approval dependency, and allowing genuine imperfection to be visible and okay, tends to restore all three of these needs more effectively than perfectionism. Even highly successful perfectionism usually does. Now let's walk through some of the specific practical techniques the book offers beyond the minimum standard, because the framework is rich with tools worth knowing. The first technique is reframing mistakes. Perfectionism treats mistakes as evidence of inadequacy, things to be avoided, hidden, or corrected as quickly as possible before anyone notices. The imperfectionist treats mistakes as data, information about what doesn't work yet, collected in the process of figuring out what does. This isn't just positive spin. It's an accurate description of how learning actually functions. Every skill any human being has ever developed was developed through a process of doing it wrong first, noticing what was wrong, adjusting, and trying again. The mistake is literally a required part of the learning sequence, not an interruption of it. Perfectionism's insistence on avoiding mistakes is therefore not just uncomfortable, it's actively incompatible with the actual process of getting better at anything. The second technique is what the book calls the next step method. When a project feels overwhelming, when the gap between where you are and where you want to be triggers the perfectionist paralysis, you narrow your entire field of attention down to the single most immediate next step, not the goal, not the timeline, not the full plan, just the next concrete action. Write the first sentence. Send one email. Make one phone call. Open the document. The brain's sense of overwhelm is largely generated by the simultaneous awareness of everything that needs to be done, projected all at once. Narrowing focus to a single next step doesn't make the project smaller. It makes the decision in front of you smaller, which is what actually determines whether you move or stay still. The third technique is using imperfection as practice rather than evidence. Every time you do something imperfectly, and the feared consequence doesn't materialize, which is most of the time, you're building actual lived evidence that imperfect performance is survivable and often simply fine. Every time you share unfinished work, and it's received better than you feared, you're updating the perfectionist's internal threat model with real data. Every time you begin something without feeling ready, and it goes reasonably well, you're chipping away at the belief that readiness is a prerequisite. This isn't a cognitive exercise. It's the accumulation of actual experience that gradually reforms the threat system's threat assessment, making perfectionism's alarm bells quiet down somewhat, because the real world keeps refusing to confirm the catastrophe they predicted. The fourth technique is separating identity from performance. One of the deepest roots of perfectionism is the belief that what you produce is what you are, that a poor piece of work makes you a poor kind of person, that a failed attempt makes you a failure, that visible imperfection in your performance reveals some underlying inadequacy in yourself. The imperfectionist practice here is consistently and explicitly separating these two things. My work is not me. My performance is not my worth. An imperfect product does not make me an imperfect person, any more than a great performance makes me a great person. I am the one who produced the work, not the work itself, and my value as a human being is not a variable that goes up and down based on the quality of my output on any given Tuesday. This sounds simple, but it's genuinely difficult to internalize, because for many people the equation between performance and worth was established early and reinforced repeatedly by educational systems, parental expectations, and professional environments that really did treat performance as the primary indicator of value. Unwiring that equation doesn't happen through a single insight. It happens through the practice of acting imperfectly, over and over again, and noticing that the world doesn't respond the way perfectionism predicted. Let's look at how these ideas and tools apply differently across different areas of life, because perfectionism shows up in distinct ways depending on where it's operating, and the specific application matters. In creative work, perfectionism is perhaps the most destructive, because creative work is fundamentally iterative. Every genuinely successful creative person who has ever existed produced quantities of mediocre or outright bad work on their way to producing the good work. This isn't a failure of the creative process. It is the creative process. The writer who waits to begin until the first sentence is perfect never produces a second sentence. The artist who only paints when they're certain the painting will be excellent produces very few paintings. The musician who won't release anything until it's flawless never gets the feedback loop from actual audiences that would have told them what was actually working. In creative work, the minimum standard is perhaps the most important tool in the entire book, because creative quality is almost entirely a function of quantity and iteration, neither of which perfectionism will ever tolerate. In professional life, perfectionism often shows up as the inability to delegate, ask for help, admit uncertainty, or deliver work that isn't fully polished. All of these behaviors make sense within the perfectionist's logic, where the primary risk is being seen as inadequate. But they all produce measurable costs in professional effectiveness. Slower output, missed collaboration opportunities, more brittle projects that depend entirely on one person's always perfect execution, and the exhaustion and resentment that come from perpetually carrying responsibilities you won't share because nobody else will do them to your standard. In relationships, perfectionism shows up as the rehearsal problem. The sense that you can't have a difficult conversation until you've prepared the perfect version of it, which means many important conversations never happen, replaced instead by the festering silence of things that weren't said imperfectly but should have been said at all. It also shows up as the performance problem, not being genuinely present in relationships because a significant portion of your attention is occupied with monitoring how you're coming across, adjusting your presentation to manage the impression you're making, rather than actually being there in the vulnerable, unguarded way that genuine connection requires. In personal growth and learning, perfectionism is perhaps most self-defeating of all, because it makes the beginning of everything feel dangerous. Learning anything new requires a visible, public phase of not being good at it yet, which perfectionism frames as intolerably threatening, which means perfectionists tend to stay within the safe boundaries of their existing competencies and avoid the learning curve of new things, which over time produces stagnation in a person who privately believes they're pursuing excellence. Let's now address the single most common objection to everything we've covered so far, the one that almost everyone has at some point while engaging with this material, because it deserves a thorough, honest answer rather than a quick dismissal. The objection isn't lowering your standards just giving up? If I stop holding myself to a high standard, won't I just produce worse work? Won't my life get worse instead of better? Isn't there value, even necessary value, in pursuing excellence? The answer the book gives, and it's a good one, is that this objection conflates two entirely different uses of the word standard. There's the standard of what you're ultimately aiming for, the quality of work you genuinely aspire to produce, the kind of person you genuinely want to become. And there's the standard of what needs to be true before you're willing to begin working toward that aspiration. The imperfectionist lowers the second standard radically. They make starting almost frictionless. They do not lower the first standard at all. They still want to produce excellent work. They still want to become an excellent version of themselves. They're just no longer willing to make the beginning contingent on guaranteeing the ending. In fact, the book argues convincingly that the imperfectionist approach tends to produce better eventual outcomes than perfectionism, not just more frequent ones. The reason is iteration. The quality of any complex work, any developed skill, any meaningful relationship is primarily a function of how many cycles of attempt feedback adjustment tree attempt you get through. More iterations almost always produce better eventual quality than fewer iterations, regardless of how carefully each individual iteration was planned. And perfectionism, by making each attempt so high stakes and so heavily loaded with self-worth implications, tends to dramatically reduce the total number of iterations a person is willing to run through, which in turn limits their eventual quality ceiling in ways they often attribute to talent or circumstance, rather than to their own reluctance to go through enough imperfect versions. The imperfectionist, by making starting cheap and failure low stakes, runs through more iterations, gets more feedback, makes more adjustments, and as a result tends to produce better work over time than the perfectionist who produces less often, more carefully, and with more psychological cost per attempt. Let's run through a few frequently asked questions before we move toward the practical close of this video. Question 1. How do I set a minimum standard without it just becoming an excuse to always do the bare minimum? The minimum standard is a floor, not a target. It represents the commitment you keep on your worst day, not the output you aim for on your average day. Once you've met the minimum, you continue as long as feels genuine, which is usually considerably beyond the minimum. The key is that the minimum needs to be honored even when you don't feel like doing more, and the rest of the session looks after itself once inertia is broken. Question 2. What if my perfectionism is part of what makes me good at my work? This is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. There is a version of high standards that genuinely improves output, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The distinction is between standards that drive effort and standards that prevent beginning. If your standards cause you to refine and improve work after it's already in progress, that's usually beneficial. If your standards cause you to delay beginning, abandon things too early, or never share work with the people whose feedback would actually improve it, those standards are costing you more than they're giving you. Question 3. What about situations where precision genuinely matters, like surgery or engineering? The book is specifically addressing the domain of personal habits, creative work, and self-development, not fields where precision is a genuine professional and ethical requirement. The minimum standard for a surgeon is not do a pretty good job on the operation. This framework is for the very different situations most people actually spend most of their time in, where the perfectionist tendency to not start, not share, or not engage without guaranteed excellent results is genuinely costing them and producing nothing. Question 4. How long does it take to actually shift a perfectionist pattern? The book is honest that this isn't a quick fix. The patterns of perfectionism are, for most people, deeply ingrained and have been reinforced for years or decades. What tends to happen with consistent practice of imperfectionist tools is a gradual shift in the default reaction. The gap between "I should do this" and "I'm doing this" gets smaller, the emotional weight of beginning gets lighter, and the catastrophizing voice that predicts disaster from imperfect outcomes gradually loses volume as real experience keeps disconfirming its predictions. But this is a process measured in months, not days, and it requires genuine, repeated practice rather than a one-time insight. Let's talk about the hidden cost of perfectionism specifically, because this is worth examining directly rather than just gesturing at vaguely. The most obvious cost is the things that never get started. The book you meant to write, the business you meant to start, the relationship you meant to pursue, the creative project you meant to begin. Every one of these unstarted things represents a version of your potential that perfectionism locked away, preserved in theory but never tested in reality, which means it produced nothing that could be improved, shared, built upon, or enjoyed by anyone, including you. The second cost is the things that got started but were abandoned before completion. Perfectionism has a particular relationship with the middle of projects, where the initial enthusiasm has worn off, and the final result is still too far away to be motivating, leaving you in the phase where the work is at its most ordinary, and the gap between current quality and desired quality is most visible. This is exactly when perfectionism's voice is loudest, and it's exactly when perfectionism causes the most abandonment, leaving a trail of half-finished things that each represent real invested effort but zero completed value. The third cost is chronic dissatisfaction. The perfectionist's relationship with their own outputs is structurally set up for perpetual disappointment because the standard is always slightly ahead of the work, meaning nothing ever quite lands as genuinely satisfying. The excellent meal is slightly overdone. The successful project had a few things you do differently. The relationship that's actually wonderful has a few patterns you'd want to change. This isn't because the perfectionist is wrong about these imperfections. They're often genuinely accurate. It's that they've developed a perceptual filter that leads with what's wrong rather than what's right, which means the genuinely good things in their life never fully register as good before the criticism machinery has already cataloged their flaws. The fourth cost is the quality of presence. Perfectionism consumes attention. The perfectionist moving through an ordinary day is often running a background process of evaluation. How is this going? How am I coming across? What might go wrong? What would be better? What's missing? This background process is not free. It runs on attention that could otherwise be available for genuine engagement with what's actually in front of you. Presence, the quality of actually being here rather than monitoring here, is one of the primary costs perfectionism extracts, and it's one of the least visible because it leaves no product, no artifact of the engagement that never quite happened. Before we move to the practical section, let me describe what it actually looks like to live a genuinely imperfectionist day, so the concept moves from abstract to concrete. An imperfectionist wakes up and doesn't wait to feel ready. They meet their minimum standard for the morning, whatever that currently is, perhaps just a glass of water and 5 minutes of writing, without requiring the morning to have a perfect cinematic quality. At work, they share a draft that they know needs work because the feedback is more valuable than the additional polish would have been. They make a decision with 70% of the information rather than waiting for complete certainty. In a conversation, they say the true but slightly awkward thing rather than the polished but hollow thing. At the end of the day, they note what they actually did rather than measuring it against some ideal version of the day that didn't happen. And none of this is because they don't care. They do care. They care enough to show up imperfectly rather than not showing up at all. Let's do a full recap. First, perfectionism is a defense mechanism, not a quality standard, built to protect the self from the experience of inadequate performance by making genuinely beginning something feel more dangerous than it actually is. Second, it comes in at least 5 forms: quality, quantity, timing, effort, and self-image perfectionism. And most people carry several of these simultaneously without recognizing them all as aspects of the same underlying pattern. Third, the core solution is the minimum standard, a deliberately tiny, essentially impossible to fail commitment that breaks the threat system's grip and allows the approach system to engage. Fourth, the flexible standard complements this by allowing real-time adjustment of expectations during the activity itself, removing the perfectionist's goalpost. Fifth, the action over results orientation removes the structural trap of evaluating effort by outcome in situations where excellent outcomes require imperfect beginnings. Sixth, specific techniques including reframing mistakes, the next step method, using imperfection as practice, and separating identity from performance all work to gradually erode the perfectionist's threat model through real accumulated experience rather than argument. And finally, imperfectionism is not lowered ambition. It is a more effective strategy for reaching ambitious goals because it removes the bottleneck of beginning and generates the iterations that quality actually requires. Tonight, before anything else, pick one thing you've been waiting to feel ready to start. Pick the most comically small version of a first step toward it. The single sentence, the first 2 minutes, the one email, the opening of the document. Set a timer for the length of that tiny action and do it the moment the video ends, not because it will produce anything significant on its own. Because the distance between where you are and where you want to be is made entirely of small steps exactly like that one, and you've been waiting for the big, perfect step long enough. Close your eyes for a moment before you go. Picture the version of you, 1 year from today, who started doing the thing imperfectly, the week after they heard someone make this argument, who kept going through the clumsy, embarrassing, clearly not yet their phase that perfectionism had convinced them was too dangerous to risk, who accumulated enough imperfect attempts that the imperfect one started getting better, then good, then genuinely excellent, in the particular rough, genuine, lived-in way that things can only get excellent through actually being done over and over. Notice what that version of you has that the current version is still waiting to earn permission to pursue. And then go begin the tiny, ridiculous, almost not worth doing version of it tonight. And let the imperfect beginning be exactly as imperfect as it needs to be. Thanks for watching all the way through. The timer starts whenever you're ready to stop waiting to feel ready. Before wrapping up, let me add something that genuinely deepens this whole framework, because I think it's the part of the book that gets quoted least but matters most. The book makes an observation about how perfectionism relates to self-compassion that is worth sitting with carefully. Most people, when they think about their perfectionism as a problem to be solved, approach it with the same perfectionist standards they apply to everything else. They want to stop being a perfectionist perfectly. They read about imperfectionism and immediately try to do it right. They set the minimum standard and then beat themselves up when they sometimes don't meet it. They practice self-acceptance and then criticize themselves for not being accepting enough. The irony is genuinely circular and also genuinely recognizable to almost everyone who has ever tried to work on their psychological patterns. The actual starting point for imperfectionism, underneath all the techniques and the minimum standards and the flexible standards, is a willingness to be kind to yourself about being imperfect, not as a final destination or an achievement you have to earn, but as a prerequisite, the operating assumption that you are allowed to be a work in progress without that meaning something terrible about your fundamental worth. This sounds simple, and it isn't. Many people who intellectually understand this have never actually extended it to themselves in a felt, genuine way. Because the perfectionist belief that you must earn the right to be okay with yourself through performance is running so deep and so quietly that it shapes how they respond to almost everything, including conversations like this one. The first and most fundamental imperfectionist practice is simply this: treating your own imperfection with at least the same warmth and patience you'd extend to a good friend who was struggling with the same thing. Not holding yourself to a standard of self-compassion that you also fail to meet perfectly. Not even necessarily feeling warm and forgiving toward your imperfections right away, because that too is something you'll get better at through practice. Just deciding, as a starting point, that imperfect effort is better than no effort, that showing up badly is better than not showing up, and that you are worth the risk of trying something that might not go well. That decision, made imperfectly and maintained imperfectly and repeatedly remade on the days you forget it, is the whole game in one sentence. Everything else in this book, and in every book like it, is just different ways of supporting and reinforcing that one core decision. Let's also talk about perfectionism in relationships specifically, because this is an area where the book's insights have some of their most immediate, visible practical effects, and where most people are least likely to recognize perfectionism as the operating mechanism. Relationship perfectionism doesn't usually look like demanding that your partner be perfect. It looks like demanding that interactions go a certain way. It looks like not having a difficult conversation until you've rehearsed it to a degree that makes beginning it feel safe. It looks like not expressing appreciation or affection until the right moment, which somehow never quite arrives. It looks like not apologizing because finding the perfect, fully accurate, completely fair articulation of what you're sorry for is genuinely difficult, and anything less than that might be misunderstood or create more conflict than it resolves. All of these are versions of the same problem, treating the potential imperfection of the interaction as more dangerous than the ongoing cost of the interaction not happening at all. The imperfectionist approach to relationships is to say the imperfect thing because saying it imperfectly is almost always better than not saying it. To have the clumsy conversation rather than waiting for the version you've rehearsed in your head to feel finally ready. To express love even when the expression isn't quite as eloquent as you'd like it to be, because the person in front of you needs to hear it now, not once you've found exactly the right words. To apologize in the approximate vicinity of what you mean, knowing that genuine intent usually lands even when the specific wording doesn't quite capture it. The perfectionist waits to connect until connection is safe, which means they often connect less than people who are willing to be slightly awkward in the interest of genuine engagement. The imperfectionist connects imperfectly, frequently, and ends up with more genuine closeness than the polished, carefully managed version of connection ever produces. One more area worth discussing is the relationship between perfectionism and creativity, because this is where the damage is perhaps most complete and most quietly devastating. Creativity is fundamentally the process of generating a large number of ideas, most of which won't work, in order to find the small number that do. Every painter has a stack of canvases they're not particularly proud of. Every writer has a drawer full of chapters that didn't make the cut. Every musician has hours of recordings they'll never release. Every innovative thinker has a long mental file of ideas that seemed promising at 3 in the morning and were clearly terrible by noon. This isn't incidental to the creative process. It is the creative process. The bad ideas are not the waste products of creativity. They're the substrate from which the good ideas are extracted. Perfectionism is structurally incompatible with this process because it makes each attempt to generate something feel high stakes rather than exploratory. The perfectionist doesn't explore. They build very carefully toward a specific known destination, and if the path veers from the plan, they stop rather than follow it. This means they miss almost everything interesting that happens at the edges of their planned route, which is where most genuine creative breakthroughs actually live. The imperfectionist approach to creativity is to treat the generative phase as completely separate from the evaluative phase, and to protect the generative phase ruthlessly from evaluative thinking. You write the terrible first draft without fixing anything, because fixing is not the job right now. You sketch the rough idea without refining it, because refining is not the job right now. You say the half-formed thought out loud without polish, because polish is not the job right now. The job right now is generation, volume, velocity, exploration. The evaluation happens afterward in a separate pass, when the raw material exists to be worked with. Mixing these two phases, which is exactly what perfectionism tends to do, kills the generative phase by introducing evaluation before there's anything real enough to evaluate. Something the book notes that is worth repeating. The people most widely recognized as creative geniuses across virtually every field in history were not people who produced only brilliant things. They were people who produced enormous quantities of things, many of which were ordinary or outright bad, and who had a higher probability of a brilliant thing appearing in that quantity, along with the persistence to keep producing long enough for it to show up. Perfectionism's promise of quality through careful, selective production consistently underperforms imperfectionism's actual output of quality through sheer, consistent, embarrassingly prolific action. Let me close this extended section with what I think is the most genuinely counterintuitive and genuinely important idea in the entire book. Imperfectionism, done well, is not the enemy of excellence. It is the most reliable path to it. Not because lowering your standards makes your work better, but because the only way to get to excellent work is through a very large quantity of imperfect work, and the perfectionist's unwillingness to produce that imperfect quantity is precisely what limits the excellent work they eventually produce. The imperfectionist who writes every day, however badly some days go, will produce better writing over the course of a year than the perfectionist who only writes on the days they feel ready to write well, because the imperfectionist had more practice, more feedback, more attempts, and more accumulated learning, all of which compound into something that looks like talent from the outside, but is actually just the output of a lot of imperfect, consistent, ongoing action. Excellence in almost every domain is a quantity game disguised as a quality game. Imperfectionism lets you play it honestly.